The flat remembers what grows in it. That's what Otis Fenn's father used to say, standing at the edge of the southern meadow in the shallow water of Pamlico Sound, pulling on his waders in the dark before the tide changed. He said the eel grass had a memory as long as the bay itself, that it didn't simply exist in place. It earned that place, season by season, by the quality of the water above it. Take the water away from the grass, even a little, even for a while, and the grass moved its edge back to where the water was good again, slowly, honestly, without any argument. Otis was 73 years old. He had been listening to that flat speak his whole life. He'd worked these waters since his father handed him a set of crab pots and a sense of where things lived. The family's grounds covered the southern flats of Pamlico Sound near Hatteras. Crabbing in summer, clamming in the fall, a small oyster operation that had been productive since his father added it in the 1960s. The southern meadow was the center of all of it, not because it was the most accessible section of their ground or the largest, but because his father had chosen that ground for the grass. Juvenile crabs sheltered in it. Clams settled in the substrate it created. The meadow was not background to what they did. It was a reason the work was worth doing in that spot and not somewhere else. His father's journals were in a wooden crate in the workshop at the end of the dock. 47 volumes. Starting in 1959, going up to the year his father's hands got bad and he stopped being able to write more than his initials in the margin. His father had kept him the way a working farmer keeps records. Not for posterity, not for any particular audience, but because knowing what the flat had done in previous years told you what it was likely to do next, and that was useful information for a man who made his living from it. The crate held everything his father had understood about this water. Otis had read every volume, some of them more than once. They did not always tell him what he needed to know in the moment he needed it, but they always told him something. Otis had started his own journals in 1978 and had not missed a season since. 45 years of entries. The crate held 47 of his father's and 45 of his own, sitting side by side, the newer volumes lighter in color, and the older ones a particular shade of age paper that went somewhere between cream and tobacco. He could read his father's handwriting faster than most people read print. The crate smelled of salt air and old paper and, faintly, of the motor oil his father had always had on his hands. Every time Otis opened it, that smell arrived before anything else did, before his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light of the workshop, before he found the right volume by its spine. 47 years of that smell was part of what the journals held, alongside the data. The southern meadow had been thinning for 3 seasons, and Otis had spent the first of those 3 seasons looking in entirely the wrong direction. He noticed a change in the way he noticed most things, not all at once, but as an accumulation of small discrepancies between what he expected to see and what was actually there. The northern edge of the meadow, where the grass met the bare sandflat, had always been a fairly consistent boundary. Not a perfect line. Eel grass edges were never perfect, but a recognizable one, stable enough that his father had sketched it on a rough chart tucked inside the front cover of the 1963 journal, and that chart had been approximately correct for as long as Otis had been reading it. In the spring of his 70th year, the edge had moved south by what he estimated to be 4 feet. He stood in the shallows and looked at the bare sand where grass had been and felt the particular unease of a man who has just noticed something he cannot immediately explain. The bare patch was new. 4 feet was enough to be certain of. He marked it with a stake. He drove into the sand and photographed it with his phone for scale. Then he went back to his work and tried not to jump to any conclusions about what it meant, because his father had taught him that the worst thing you could do with a single observation was treat it like a pattern. He did not succeed entirely at this. By the end of that week, he had been thinking about it every day. He found himself checking the reference point twice on his next 3 trips to the southern flat, each time measuring the distance from the stake to the nearest grass. Each time, the grass was in the same place it had been when he staked it, which meant the edge wasn't moving week by week. It had moved between seasons, and now it was holding. That almost reassured him. Almost. He thought about boats. The State Highway Department had been working on the Hatteras Bridge replacement for 18 months, and the construction zone had brought more vessel traffic through this section of the Sound than Otis had seen in his lifetime. Survey boats, work barges, dredge tenders, equipment delivery vessels, all of them moving to the corridor at various stages of the tide, all of them generating wakes and propeller wash in water that had previously been worked only by local fishing vessels running at speeds the Flat was accustomed to. He spent the remainder of that first season documenting vessel traffic. He logged departure times from the marina, estimated speeds to the corridor, correlated arrivals with tide stages. He carried a yellow notebook specifically for this purpose and filled 2/3 of it before the cold weather ended his dive season. The work felt productive. It felt like the right kind of attention. He was following the most visible change in the environment, the one that anyone standing at the dock's end could point to and describe. He had a method and a record, and the feeling that he was doing what his father would have done, paying close attention to the thing most likely to be relevant. At night, at the workshop table, he would spread the yellow notebook beside whichever of his father's journals covered the corresponding season and compare what he was seeing against what his father had seen. His father had logged vessel traffic, too, in a less systematic way. A line here and there about a barge coming through, a tug passing, a survey boat that showed up in October one year and was gone by November. The traffic had never been heavy, and his father had never flagged it as something affecting the Meadow. Otis noted this. He noted it, but did not let it change his direction, because the traffic now was categorically different from anything his father had described. Work barges, equipment platforms, crane vessels, diesel power machinery running at irregular hours. His father had never seen anything like this on this water, so his father's silence on the subject proved nothing. By the following spring, the edge had moved 6 more feet. He presented the vessel traffic data at a routine construction monitoring meeting held at the County Extension Office that March. About 15 people attended, mostly marina operators and commercial fishing permit holders who had been invited to provide community input on the construction's environmental compliance. Whitfield, the state's environmental compliance officer, listened to Otis's full presentation. He was a careful man, thorough in his responses, and he addressed the vessel traffic data directly. He said that wake modeling for construction corridors showed wake heights within acceptable parameters for eelgrass habitats at the distances involved. He also provided context Otis hadn't previously had. Eelgrass decline in Pamlico Sound had been documented regionally for more than a decade, attributed to water quality changes associated with agricultural runoff, stormwater, and broader land use shifts. He pointed Otis to 3 published studies documenting this trend. He was not dismissive. He was accurate, and he was respectful, and he clearly had some familiarity with the Fenn family's tenure on this water, which meant he was not simply processing Otis as an uninformed complainant. He had done his homework. He had the studies. He had the permit data. Otis left the meeting with copies of the studies and a complicated feeling he couldn't entirely name. The drive back to the dock took 20 minutes, and he spent most of it thinking about what it meant to be correct about a regional trend while being wrong about a specific location. The regional data was real. The decline was documented. But his Meadow had existed within that regional trend for 30 years without declining, and now it was declining, and the regional explanation did not account for timing. He read the studies at Winter, slowly and carefully, using a dictionary twice when the terminology got technical. They were careful work, and they described real conditions. The regional decline was documented. The water quality issues were real. Pamlico Sound eelgrass was under pressure from factors that had nothing to do with any single construction project. But his father's journal showed the Southern Meadow thriving in 1989, in 1995, in 2003, in years when the regional trend should already have been affecting it. If the broader water quality decline was the cause of what he was seeing, why had his Meadow been holding through all those years and was only now retreating? He thought about the studies for a long time. He sat at the workshop table and thought about the vessel traffic data he'd spent a season collecting. He thought about what else had changed. And sometime in March, sitting with his father's 1963 journal open to the Rough Meadow sketch, he noticed something he had read before but had not read carefully enough. His father had written, in a late November entry from 1971, a description of a particularly muddy season following a series of hard northeasters. Grass on the south edge went thin this fall. Water ran muddy all October. Light couldn't reach the roots. It'll come back in spring if the weather settles. But this is the kind of year that shows you where the edges are. And then, the following April, edge came back about 2/3. Grass remembers the boundary. Takes a couple good years to rebuild. Light couldn't reach the roots. He read those 6 words several times. He sat back in his chair and looked at the workshop ceiling, which had the same pattern of old wood grain and dried salt stains it had always had. And he thought about what his father had been trying to record in 1971. Not a theory, not a hypothesis. A working observation made by a man who needed the meadow to recover and was trying to understand the conditions under which it would. Light couldn't reach the roots. It was not a technical finding. It was a practical one. A man saying, here is what the grass needs, and here is why it isn't getting it this season. Otis had read that entry before. He had read all of his father's entries, some of them multiple times. He had read that one in 2008, when a hurricane season had stirred up the sound and the grass had thinned briefly before recovering. He had read it as confirmation of something he already understood. He had not read it as a diagnostic tool until now. The state's turbidity monitoring for the bridge construction showed levels within permitted parameters. He had seen those reports at the monitoring meetings. He had accepted them as accurate because they were accurate. The monitoring was conducted at the surface and at mid-column depths, the standard protocol for construction turbidity assessment, and the readings at those depths were within allowable limits. He thought about where eel grass did its photosynthesis. Not at the surface, not at mid-column, at the roots, in the substrate, where light had to travel all the way through the water column to reach it. His father had not used technical language. His father had used the language of a man who had watched the meadow go thin after a muddy autumn, and understood that the relationship between light and roots was a critical one. Whatever the water looked like from the surface, he thought about whether a turbidity plume carrying very fine particles, the kind that settled slowly, that dispersed in the upper water column, without completely clearing before reaching the bottom, might show acceptable readings at the depths the monitoring instruments measured while still reducing the light reaching the grass at the depth that mattered. He did not know enough about sediment physics to answer this himself. He knew eelgrass. He knew what his father had written in 1971. He called the University Extension Office and asked if there was anyone studying eelgrass light requirements. 3 weeks later, he received a call from a graduate student named Reyes. She was 26, finishing her dissertation on eelgrass photosynthesis thresholds in coastal North Carolina, and she came out the following April on the first clear day of the season with a cooler full of equipment he didn't recognize and more enthusiasm than he was quite prepared for at 6:30 in the morning. She explained what she was to do in terms that were more technical than he needed, but not unfriendly. She was going to measure the actual light reaching different depths of the water column, specifically the photosynthetically active radiation, the wavelengths that matter to plant growth, at the surface at mid-column and immediately above the grass substrate. She would run the sensors through construction turbidity events and through clear water periods and compare the readings. She waded out to the southern edge of the meadow with a canvas bag full of sensor housings, moving through the water with the easy confidence of someone who had done this in many conditions, and he watched her work from the dock. She placed the first sensor housing carefully, recorded its position with a GPS unit, and then moved methodically to the next position. He thought about his father watching vessels from the same dock in the winter mornings, making notes about things that had no obvious connection to anything yet. The look of paying careful attention, from a distance, to something in the water. He brought her coffee at 8 o'clock, and she drank it standing in ankle-deep water without coming to shore, which he respected. Reyes ran the sensors for 4 weeks, through 2 construction turbidity events and 2 clear water periods. The surface readings and mid-column readings tracked closely, confirming what the state's monitoring had shown, within permitted parameters during construction events. The compliance data was accurate. The readings at grass substrate depth told a different story. During the construction turbidity events, when pile driving and dredge work disturbed the bottom sediment and released fine particles into the water column, those particles settled through the column at a rate that placed maximum density exactly in the zone where grass required light for photosynthesis. Light at the substrate level dropped to roughly 30% of what was available at mid-column. 30% was below the threshold that eelgrass literature documented as sufficient for growth in the shallower sections of a sound meadow. The surface measurements had been accurate. They had been measuring the wrong layer. Otis read Reyes' preliminary data at his workshop table, with his father's 1971 entry open beside her printed charts. He thought about the yellow notebook he had filled with vessel traffic data the previous season. He had documented a real change in the environment. The vessel traffic had genuinely increased. He had simply spent a season attributing the wrong consequence to a real change. He had been wrong about the cause for an entire season. He had followed a real change. The vessel traffic was genuinely higher than it had ever been, and attributed to it a consequence it was not causing. He had spent a season filling a yellow notebook with the wrong answer. He said this plainly to Reyes when she came back to share the preliminary data. Sitting at the workshop table with the light sensors charts between them and his father's 1971 journal open nearby, she said that was often how these things worked. The most visible change in the environment was rarely the primary cause of the most important consequence. He said he knew that, or had known it. He had forgotten it for a season. She asked to photograph his father's November 1971 entry. He said yes. She photographed on her phone, and then stood there for a moment reading it again before she put her phone away. Reyes filed a formal request with the State Department of Transportation to review the construction monitoring protocol. The review was methodical, took 4 months, and found her approach technically sound. The department modified the protocol. Light sensors at substrate depth were added to the environmental monitoring program for the remainder of the bridge project. The data collected under the revised protocol across the following construction season confirmed the substrate level findings. The department could not halt construction. The bridge was too far along, the contract terms too fixed, but they could and did modify the schedule for the heaviest turbidity generating work, restricting pile driving to incoming tides and periods of lower natural water clarity where the Meadow was already operating under reduced light conditions. The rate of Meadow retreat slowed noticeably in the final construction season. Revegetation plugs were planted along the northern margin the autumn the bridge opened. Reyes published her dissertation findings the following year. The paper had a section on historical observational data, and it cited Otis's journals as a primary record establishing pre-construction Meadow extent and the timing of the decline. 65 years of documentation, showing the Meadow's behavior before any external pressure arrived. It cited his father's 1971 notation about light and roots as the interpreted connection that had directed the investigation towards substrate-level measurement rather than surface monitoring. That notation got a footnote in a peer-reviewed journal, written in plain language by a man sorting crab pots on a cold November evening, because he had noticed something and thought it mattered. Otis stood at the edge of the southern meadow the spring after the bridge opened. Some of the revegetation plugs had taken. Not the full meadow his father had sketched in the 1963 chart, but something at the edge was moving back toward where it had been, and the substrate that had always been good for it. He wrote the entry for that morning. Water temperature, visibility, grass edge position at 3 reference points, revegetation plug growth status. Then he added one more line, the kind his father would have written. Grass is moving back north. Light's better now. It knows where it wants to go. He put the journal in his jacket pocket and waded back to the dock. The flat ran north in both directions, covered by moving water the color of pale jade in the early spring light, holding what it held and doing what it had always done. It did not know that a bridge had taken 3 seasons from its southern edge. It did not know that a graduate student's light sensors and a man's 45 years of notebooks had finally combined to explain what the monitoring instruments had missed. The flat knew only what eelgrass knew, light or darkness at the roots, good water or bad, the boundary it could keep and the boundary it had to give back. It had been moving that boundary honestly for longer than anyone who had ever worked it could remember. And now, one spring at a time, it was moving it back.